Hello and welcome to our webinar at SIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. My name is Awais Khan. I'm a senior researcher at SIGA. Today we have a good friend of mine and also a distinguished scholar in the field of anthropology. Our webinar series is a platform for us to engage cutting research in the field of Islam and international relations. Oftentimes, we either discuss pertinent issues in the region or we allow for theoretical reflections on how to study the main questions undergirding international relations in our region. Today, I'm honored to have Mia Canada, grew up in Pakistan and Canada, and studied a year in Syria before completing his BA at the University of Alberta. Later on, he finished his PhD in anthropology at Berkeley. His work mainly explores ethical formation and aesthetic sensibilities and political theologies in contemporary Islam. He focuses on the ethnography of migration and hospitality, especially in places like northern Jordan and western Canada. More theoretically, his work focuses on the ambivalence of loss and the work of repair and the life of tradition. Many of his themes are timely in discussing certain of the problems and the fault lines in our region. We thought for this particular webinar, we engage Professor Iqbal's recent work. He's working on a number of manuscripts in Muslim humanitarian practices and the refugee crisis, fallout from the war in Syria. I thought this would be a nice platform for him to informally, introduces his new work. There's an original piece he's working on, and he wanted to, we thought that in this pandemic situation, it would be a good place for him to kind of have a critical platform where we could discuss and provoke him, and he could also provoke us in thinking about our immediate neighbors and immediate situation. So I'm going to hand it over to Professor Iqbal for him to kind of walk us through his most recent research project and what his ideas are. As far as time is concerned, we'll try to do, because we don't have a lot of panelists, we'll try to do a 45-45 split. So 45 minutes, he talks about his paper, and then 45 minutes, we will ask him a number of questions about his work and about how he sees the region. And then questions and answers, you're more than welcome. It's live on Facebook. So all participants are more than welcome to send their questions either on Facebook or through any of our hosts. I will funnel those questions to Professor Iqbal. Yes, Basit, it's you. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. How's my audio now? It's okay. All right, very good. Thank you, of course, for the introduction and for the invitation and for coordinating. I think by way of introduction, I should say that this paper is something that I worked on a couple of years ago, but then had to set it aside for various reasons. And so I'm returning to it now with a view to finalizing it. So I look forward to our conversation afterward. And I should say something too about its genre. So although it's partly based in my fieldwork, which is with refugees and aid workers in the wake of the Syrian uprising and as based in Jordan and Canada, this paper is not strictly ethnographic. nor is it normative in the sense of reclaiming the concept of the Ummah for our times today, nor is it a work of political theory, which tries to define the concept of Ummah against other competing concepts for naming community. Instead, it emerges from the sense kind of doing some reading and some writing in the field of Islamic humanitarianism, that often the analytic imperative that I felt guided toward was to determine whether Muslims are doing relief work for humanity in some universal sense, or only for the Ummah or other fellow Muslims in some particular sense. And so this play between the universal and the particular is kind of an analytic problem that I felt in trying to account for Muslim humanitarian practices that I was kind of being pushed toward. And I find it to be a methodological trap as well. And so what I mean to say is that in terms of my approach to the Ummah, I'm seeking to step away from the historicist trick by which the social scientist exposes the modernity of what the believer thinks is a traditional concept. So that would be a kind of analysis that comprehends something through referring it to the proper historical context. And so it'd be something like, we have this concept of Ummah in these sites of Muslim humanitarianism. It's an ideological concept that is shaped by this or that politics, and that would be sufficient as an account of the Ummah. And that seems deeply inadequate to me. And so I'm going to return to some of those methodological questions shortly, but for now, I'll just say that ultimately what I'm hoping this paper does is kind of, instead of doing that work of exposure, simply it's got a more modest aim, I would say, and it's to present three different figures of the Ummah today. Figures not in the sense of, three different people, but three figures in the sense of three images, three conceptualizations, three ways of thinking about the Ummah today, which circulate in the sites of my fieldwork. So these are figures of its loss and of its betrayal. And ultimately, what I'm hoping to get toward is some kind of traction on how these figures articulate a set of political and ethical relations. And so instead of referring back to this kind of constant dynamic between the universal and the particular, instead just trying to understand what these figures are and what they convene. So that's kind of the broad aim of this paper. And it tacks back and forth between different archives, different kind of ethnographic moments as well. But that's kind of like the broad conceptual point. All right, so I'll jump in. The Scottish historian and Harvard Orientalist Sir Hamilton Gibb once gave a short address to the American Philosophical Society titled "The Community in Islamic History." Islam shares a lot with Christianity, he began, given their shared monotheism and their shared heritage in the Near East. But Islam also configured itself as a correction of and a challenge to Christianity, as expressed explicitly in its rejection of the Trinity, but also in a whole range of other more subtle ways. And one of those ways is the concept of Ummah, community, which for Gibb is, he says, the key word for everything that has to do with Islamic culture. It is in the historical development of this concept and its modalities that the true significance of Islamic history and culture must be sought. So how to secure, how to maintain that unity became the continuing question for members of the community and the central theme of its history. So the key to unlocking Islamic history is in this concept of Ummah. But then how do you do that, right? So by Gibb's account, the Islamic notion of Ummah that is something that's partially articulated in critique of Christianity and in critique of the world that it built. He describes in broad strokes how amid various theological and juridical differences and political partisanship, what held the community together was not any kind of formal organization, but a collective act of will, inspired by personal conviction and a sense of election and sustained by ritual duties. But ultimately, as this history proceeded, because there were no kind of political institutions that were grounding this collective will, ultimately this led to a kind of stagnation among Muslims, that Muslims rejected material values and rationalism and instead turned to a kind of absolutist faith, and this left them unable to meet new challenges. And ultimately, he says, this resulted in a situation where the Muslim lived in a world of symbols, where nothing is really what it seems, and words mean something other than what they say. So here we've got Ummah as the key to unlocking Islamic history, and the kind of history it sets in motion is one of a kind of inversion. Initially, it's a kind of a dialectical inversion. So initially, Ummah is what holds the community together, and then as time goes on, because this act of will is not grounded outside itself, it doesn't have anything to rely on outside itself, and then it basically evacuates the ground of its own possibility and leaves Muslims unable to meet new challenges, and it generates its own world of symbols. So Ummah here is something that founds a world, but a world that's not necessarily sustainable in relation to, you know, the other world of colonialism and geopolitics. This is Gibbs' account. This is what explains why under colonialism, Muslims turn to one modern ideology after another. So it has come to the pass that today, he says, in 1917 or something, in the confusions and spiritual distress generated by these various philosophies, men ask whether an Islamic community really exists any longer. So this question of whether the Ummah exists, you know, is ongoing. Most political observers discount it, but in Islamic matters, it is never wise to rely upon external indices. So if you're just looking from the outside, you won't see the Ummah, right? And so what he's warning is that when it comes to Islam, it's never wise to rely upon external indices or the external indications. The idea of such community based in common will is still vigorously alive beneath these drastic reconstructions and readjustments that conceal its inner core. So what I take that to mean is that, you know, history has proceeded. The Ummah looks very different now than it used to. Different kinds of political institutions have emerged with various, you know, various degrees of adequacy, various degrees of sovereignty and so on. But somewhere, somehow, in some modality, Islamic community endures. So this is kind of the picture that Gibb presents us with, right? In which the question of the Ummah is at once key, it's integral to understanding Islam and Muslims in the world, but also it's highly ambiguous, and it's hard to understand. It's hard to get some traction on this question if you're looking from the outside. And given the extent of these drastic reconstructions and readjustments, you know, there's no guarantee that looking from the inside is going to do any better. So that's kind of the scene that Gibbs sets out for us. And it's one that I'll kind of keep referring back to. The Quranic sense of Ummah is generic. So every community has received a divine messenger or a warner who reminds them of the divine promise and threat before judgment comes to them. Thus we have made, in one ayah, thus we have made the deeds of every community seem fair unto them. Then to their Lord shall be their return, and he will inform them of what they used to do. So communities can be blinded to the truth of their own deeds, requiring a kind of divine disclosure, and they can be internally divided, as when some from a community heed the divine message while others do not. But still they ought to cleave together. And among the multitude of communities, each with their appointed term and with their set right, the final dispensation distinguishes the Muslims, which fulfills the supplication of the Prophet Ibrahim in calling to the good, enjoining right, forbidding wrong. And so rather than simply being one community among others, the community that is here divinely addressed inherits through the finality of the Quranic revelation a singular mission, to be a middle community, to be witnesses for humankind so that the messenger can be a witness upon you and so on, or for you and so on. So these themes of unity and the inheritance of a divine mandate, of witness and of justice, these themes course through the sites of my fieldwork with Muslim humanitarians and refugees. But the emphasis on the Ummah as a political body is not simply the result of a kind of post-colonial reaction, as some observers have claimed. Even in early Islamic history, such verses had clear political traction. So taken together, the distributed authority and the universal mission of the community, even as granted in the Quran, yield a dynamic vision, which Uwaymir Anjum writes, makes the Ummah the community of all the believers, the recipient of the Prophet's mission to humankind. That's first. It also requires rendering qualified obedience to authorities from among themselves. It requires shura, the practice of participation and consultation. It considers the community's collective affairs in need of rational human management, and considers the caliph answerable to those he rules, the community. So for his part, Anjum carefully traces the historical trajectory of this community-centered vision, in which the caliph is accountable to the community against what he calls a ruler-centered Islamic political thought, which emerged under the Umayyad dynasty, and a Sunnah-centered variant, which synthesized elements of each. So eventually, kind of in this historical account, the tradition of Sunni political thought effectively disappeared the community from the political equation. So the community's will is no longer for political purposes an instrument or the best approximation of God's will. God's will is done regardless of whom the electors choose as caliph and what the community wills. And so the political claims of the community, however they're articulated and whatever that means, are effectively relinquished in this literature of early Islamic political thought. So that's a very hasty history, and I'm not trying to kind of sketch out its details, and I'm sure it can be questioned in various ways, but I hope only to establish that in this conceptual history of the community, there are more and less politically attractive iterations. So there's a range of political traction available for this concept of the Ummah within already internal to its history. So when my interlocutors insist on the political role of the Ummah, they're not simply inventing an Islamic version of popular sovereignty. Instead, they can be understood to recall, now in a post-colonial and globalized world, aspects of that early community-centered political vision as well. And I'm sure that there are a range of other examples, that can be turned to across Muslim history, right? As, kind of to substantiate this connection, not to establish a kind of a line of continuity, but just to to get some reference points. So in one common example, or one clear example of this, the reformist Rashid Rida explicitly attributes coercive power to the Ummah, not to the ruler. He says that true obedience is due only to God, and worldly authority belongs to the body of the community, the Jama'ah, and the chief, or the Ra'is, is only a representative of its unity. And so although the Caliphate gives the Ummah political unity, the authority of the Ummah precedes that political institution. And his work was repeatedly recommended to me by my reformist interlocutors in Jordan and in Canada. They remembered his insistence that the unity of the Ummah was both divinely mandated and also had to be historically cultivated. And they also remembered his involvement in the struggle for Syria, and they said that this is the consciousness that we still need today. So other inquiries into the Ummah often survey, these kinds of Quranic or Muslim historical articulations, and then turn to our contemporary world, just I guess in a kind of echo of the way I'm doing here. So their question is often, is the Ummah a fact, or is it an aspiration? It certainly provides an affective symbol for modern Muslim politics. It idealizes Muslim unity in the face of, a whole roster of different kinds of differences. But the Ummah is also instrumentalized by different governments and non-governmental bodies, and it becomes this kind of ideological concept that can do different things in different ways. So one recent book on the topic, it tracks two competing registers of this concept of Ummah, one register being identity and the other register being instrumentality. And so through tracking these two registers, the hope is to account for its conceptual ambivalence across different moments of Muslim history. Which is important, and I've certainly learned from it, but my own effort to consider competing figures of the Ummah, as I'm slowly working toward, seeks to discern some of its modalities, in Gibbs' term, without adopting this kind of diagnostic mode of analysis, right? We've got the ideal, we've got the reality. How does the reality meet the ideal? What are the, and so on. And so instead of that diagnostic mode of analysis, how else, can we approach the Ummah? Especially, and it gets complicated also because even translating Ummah as a community is a complex operation because it cannot be historically located easily. On the one hand, as a political community in symbolic relation to an institution of the Caliphate, it was historically implicated in an ethico-juridical regime whose inherited mission was nothing less than the discovery of the divine law and living by it. But on the other hand, the Islamic juridical categories that applied to territory did not correspond to the limits of that sociological community. So instead we have, these terms of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, in which the legal regime and the sociological community don't necessarily overlap. And so in the image of a political community that we inherit through, a different lexicon, where law and territory are seen as overlapping with population, then this concept of Ummah seems to disarticulate some of those kind of overlapping registers. So yes, so then this question of law in relation to history and territory and population also becomes implicated when people are considering the question of Ummah today. And so this post-colonial fate of Islamic law was often raised by my interlocutors also in considering the present state of the Ummah. In doing so, social scientists might argue my interlocutors symptomatically express the tensions which organize Islamic politics today. So Jamil Aydin, for instance, insists that Ummah is a properly theological term, which today only perpetuates the illusion of geopolitical Muslim unity. And he argues that Ummah cannot be historically translated into the, this notion of a globalized Muslim world because the latter did not exist before the mid-19th century. And so living in Darul Islam, practicing Islam, belonging to the Ummah, all those things were always mediated by imperial ties and local realities. It was only after various reform-minded Ottoman elites sought to participate in the international order that a new Muslim world identity was promulgated, tied to the prestige of the caliph as being civilized, and so on. And then came colonial fears of pan-Islamism. This is his account of kind of this tangled relationship between Ummah and Muslim world, and between pan-Islamism and Muslim anti-colonial solidarities. These consolidated this new identity, and kind of crucially affected the grammar of this concept. And Faisal Devji makes a similar argument, finding the idea of a single Muslim Ummah not only disingenuous because it mystifies the actual politics that are happening, but also dangerously anti-political because it alienates Muslims from politics that they could otherwise engage. And Olivier Roy writes that the globalization of Islam has deterritorialized the religion so that various, as he says, neo-fundamentalists seek a new purified Ummah, or a purified new Ummah. So we have these accounts of the Ummah that insist either on its the difference between its ideal and its reality, or insist on the elusive, or the illusory nature of its rhetoric, right? On the danger of the Ummah, on its disingenuous quality, on its alienating aspect, and so on. So these are often kind of the terms that we have available to approach the Ummah within various forms of social science. And they often overwhelmingly emphasize the relationship between Sharia and political sovereignty. And when they do consider Islamic community, they do so mostly with a view to its implications for the nation state. So granting all that, what I'm trying to do here simply is foreground some of those modalities of the Ummah in Gibbs' terms, and also take seriously the methodological provocation of his account, where he says external indices are not reliable. And on the one hand, it binds the community together, but also kind of hollows out the grounds of that legibility. So he says that kind of a standard historical account will not do to understand the Ummah as key to Muslim history. My reading of that is that those accounts of the Ummah remain at the level of what the French linguist Émile Benveniste calls the historical plane of enunciation, or récit. So from the perspective of secular historical narration, a number of historians and social scientists have persuasively argued that the language of Ummah has been thoroughly transformed by the grammar of the nation state in some of the ways that I've just been laying out, so that Ummah has been recoded to align with the modern categories of nation or Islamic society. And by this account, by this account, continued use of the rhetoric of Ummah, which ignores such transformations, is historically naive and has dubious implications for contemporary politics, right? So that was Hua and Devji and so on. In contrast to that approach, though, this paper lingers with what Benveniste calls the plane of discursive enunciation, not the kind of impersonal field of history, but the personal one of discourse, or discours, where what's of interest is not, this kind of world historical transformation of Ummah from the realm of theology to modern secular geopolitics, but instead a set of relationships between speaker and addressee that are convened through the act of enunciation. So in referring to this contrast between history and discourse, I'm relinquishing maybe any claims to that kind of broader, to commenting on that broader transformation, and in the historical sense, and marking out that my interest is far more maybe limited. And in these exchanges, in this set of relationships, the historical meaning of such exchanges is more difficult to locate or fix, because it occurs through dialogue. It occurs through through intersubjective language. It happens through figures that are equally necessary to the dialogue, in the sense that their perspectives cannot be, undermined or kind of set into perspective against, a broader ideological transformation and so on. And also because the time of the present is consistently disturbed by, the continuation of that discourse, of that dialogue. So the time of meaning of what the Ummah means as it emerges through these exchanges cannot be stabilized through reference to historical context. So all of this is a lengthy methodological prelude to say that I'm less interested in searching for what Gibb called the vigorous inner core of the Ummah, than in following various articulations of Ummah, which always occur in dialogue, in argument, and contestation, as part of what Salah al-Assad calls, part of a discursive tradition for which the present is not simply the empty ground for staging the teleological progression from past to future. Rather, in Assad's terms, that in tradition, the present is always at the center, right? So what's key to, to understanding the Ummah in this way, with relation in reference to this notion of discursive tradition, is how it's articulated today, without claiming by extension that this articulation exhausts the concept of Ummah, right? So the tradition itself is not defined by the present, and so even though the grammar of the nation state may have conscripted the language of Ummah in our secular age, we must also, and now I'm quoting Assad, also attend to the way time present is separated from, but also included within events and epochs, to perceive how agents consciously inhabit different kinds of time simultaneously and try to straddle the gap between experience and expectation. So this is an effort to attend to how past and present and future, how past and future are related through the space of the present, and in which, the meaning of what's at stake here, in this case, this language or concept of Ummah, when approached this way, cannot be kind of delimited through historical context in this way. So in what follows, I'm exploring two such dialogues, drawn in part from my field work with Muslim relief workers and refugees in the wake of the Syrian civil war, in order to consider interruption, abandonment, and ruin as three modalities of the life of the Ummah today. So not, saying this is the Ummah, right? This is its inner core. This is, its kind of defining features, and then, something might happen to it. History might happen to the Ummah, but instead thinking that the life of the Ummah itself occurs through different modalities, and some of these might include today interruption, abandonment, and ruin. And this is one lesson, I would say, of the work of Sabah Mahmood, the third anniversary of whose passing from this world we are marking today. And her work these days is sometimes caricatured in certain tendentious ways, but she would insist that we attend to the fabric of relationships that endure an incapacitation, and to the political and the ethical relationships that these disclose. All right, so dialogue number 1. 15 years ago in Damascus, a friend and I attended a discussion between two Muslims. One was a Syrian professor of Quran recitation and Hanafi jurisprudence. The other was a scholar visiting from the West. The latter had requested the meeting to discuss the status of the juridical terms Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, given that they're not found in the Quran. The Syrian professor has illustrious scholastic licenses granted from the most renowned scholars of the Levant and the Hejaz, and the visiting scholar, in contrast, does not have formal training in the Islamic sciences, but worked for a time in Western academia, and so some of the kind of that this pedigree maybe is expressed in the tenor of their conversation. The Syrian sheikh apologized for not having had the time to fully prepare a response, but he listed a lengthy series of classical scholars, including the eponymous leaders of the Islamic legal schools who had employed these terms. And so because they employed these terms, they're valid for the Ummah today. And that's like with any other Islamic term, which was defined after the revelation. So the scholastic terms came later on, but their meaning was already present. But the traditional basis of these terms was not what the scholar was after. He said, my question was whether their definition has remained fixed. My understanding is that at least one aspect of these terms is to define the relationship between the individual and the state. But we don't live in a caliphate, and how the state affects individual lives, that too has changed. The sheikh was skeptical that modern governmentality affected the status of these terms, while the visiting scholar pointed to the fact that ostensibly Muslim governments were themselves engaged in using bulldozers and helicopters and airplanes to bombard the Muslims, while those in power are openly pursuing all manner of non-Islamic practices. So he says it becomes difficult to define a place as Darul Islam today. And meanwhile, most people already live in a non-Muslim mental space, relying on, technological or on technology and economic relations that come from the West. So how much of Darul Islam remains when it's all being invaded and reshaped and so on? The Sheikh responded that there's never existed a perfect Darul Islam, but one's neighbors' interests are one's own. And unfortunately, in our time, it's very cloudy because there's no caliph. 100 years ago, even those Muslims who lived as far as India or Morocco were attached to the caliphate. Now it's more cloudy, but for Muslims in reading history, this is the exception. It's not the usual practice. So I'm not going to lay out their full conversation, but I'll just note that each of these interlocutors was deeply vested in the possibilities of Muslim flourishing under post-colonial conditions of state and market, but they fundamentally differed in how they regarded the contemporary situation, as well as in how to inherit the terms of Islamic legal traditions to which they were both committed. Their conversation, it condenses what Aydin describes as the major themes of pan-Islamism, including a notion of Islamic civilization, a deep historical conflict between Islam and the West, and so on. So these two partners to the conversation agreed, despite their differences, that the West was at war with Islam, that Muslim societies were collectively weakened, but they could rise together and more. But the conversation also demonstrates the complexity of the question. So it's not, their dynamic isn't simply, I think, reducible to the terms of that kind of vestigial pan-Islamism left over from, the imperial context many decades ago. For as Salah al-Asad once wrote about the Ummah concept, the crucial point is not that it's imagined, but that what is imagined predicates distinctive modes of being and acting. So over the course of their exchange, the visiting scholar expanded a perception of governmentality into a critique of globalization, while the Syrian sheikh emphasized an abiding eschatological dimension to the practice of the law. And neither of them ignored the historical diversity which historians employ to undermine the idea of a Muslim world. So it was their affective attachment to the Ummah in all its diversity, which accounted for the pain they each felt at perceiving the contemporary condition of the world. So that was kind of the first dialogue. With a view on time, I'm going to condense aspects of the second one.
You continue. I think the second dialogue would be very important for our later discussion. So
okay, sounds good. I'll do so.
Feel free to expound on it.
Okay. So in the second dialogue, this is one between myself and the director of a charitable organization in Oman, a Salafi organization that does a lot of work in refugee support. And this organization, it pays for cancer treatments, and it hosts orphans, it teaches Quran and distributes food. And I'd asked the director of this organization once, about the Ummah in various conversations, but one time I specifically mentioned, this famous hadith about, the believers being one body. And he immediately knew it, and then he referred to another hadith about the Ummah, that my community is like rain, you know not which of it is best, the first of it or the last of it. But I was curious specifically about what he meant about the believers being one body. What does it mean for the believers, to be a single body in our time today? But when I asked about that, he just laughed a little and said that it's easy to understand in our time of tribulation. I don't need to kind of overthink it. The hadith already says what it means, which is that the faithful have mutual concern for one another. But what people don't usually understand, he said, is how to practice their obligations to each other, including Islamic activists as well, right? They don't perceive how their responses to such suffering can be compromised. So the hadith describes the situation, but the social forms that are available to respond to it have their own corruption built into them. Their own corruption in the sense of, there might be, forms of humanitarian aid, speaking specifically to his context, that might undermine the dignity of those involved and of the so-called beneficiaries and so on. I wanted to kind of bring this back to some of these scriptural coordinates as I was trying to understand them in relation to his work. And he said, and so I said, I was also thinking of the verse that says that, that you are the best of communities. And he said, no, but we need to finish reading to the end of the verse, right? That it continues, تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. You enjoin what's right and forbid what's wrong. And so he said, he would say that the first phrase about being the best community is conditional on the second, as in, you will be the best of communities if you do these things. It doesn't happen on its own. He continued, but then think of the other hadiths about Ummah as well. The trial or the fitna of my community is wealth. The destruction of my Ummah is in killing one another. And then look around the lands of the Muslims today. We have wealth, but we're in poverty. We are one Ummah, but have sanctified the Sykes-Picot borders and are killing each other. We can't even stop massacres happening 50 kilometers away. So the next part of this paper goes a bit into the crisis at the border in summer 2018, when the Syrian regime and its Russian allies were bombing the south of Syria, and then tens of thousands of people rushed to the border with Jordan and with Israel, trying to seek some kind of international visibility and some kind of recourse or safe passage. The social media streams filled up with videos of people kind of calling on the Ummah right? Asking, what is this silence, right? And all that to say that in response to that, eventually, individuals and communities across Jordan gathered aid and collected it in a square at the border and sent it across into Syria to some of the people who were stationed, or kind of who had fled there. And the director of that same Salafi charity was instrumental in kind of coordinating some of that at a time when the international NGOs simply said, that they could do nothing because, the crisis was on the other side of this border. Right. So here we have certain territorial borders that are, dividing up the community in which there's clear suffering, and the political institutions that we inhabit, including those of the international aid sector, throw up their hands and relinquish certain responsibilities because they say it's not within their mandate. And then we have some of these Muslim charities that that say no, regardless of these borders of territorial sovereignty, there's still a kind of obligation here that we need to meet. And so that same director of the Salafi charity, he held a series of meetings with government officials, and I saw him at the square where this aid was being gathered, taking a video on his cell phone, to broadcast on Facebook as well. And he said, on this blessed day, the trucks have been arriving from around Jordan, from Mafraq, from Irbid, from Jarash, and that this is like the hadith of the Prophet, that no one believes while his neighbor lies hungry. We ask God to relieve the afflicted, to accept our martyrs into paradise, to shield the vulnerable, and to reward our Syrian and Jordanian brethren. The hearts of the faithful extend across these borders where we're standing. This is the meaning of the prophetic hadith about the Muslim community, that the faithful are one body, that when a single limb feels pain, the entire body aches with sleeplessness and fever. So these two dialogues, right, between this exchange in Damascus, over a dozen years ago, and then this more recent engagement with this Jordanian activist and sheikh, they depart from the paradigms often invoked to explain contemporary Islamic political theology. Whether we are talking about the robust pan-Islamism of the early 20th century, or the exhausted market democracy of post-Islamism in the late 20th century. Each of these interlocutors would agree that the Islamic community is not flourishing, that it is absent the form of sovereignty proper to it, meaning at minimum, the ability to protect its own integrity. But what is the mode of its current life? For the Syrian sheikh in Damascus many years ago, the nature of the incapacitation of the Ummah takes the form of an interruption. So he says that history is like the sea, which rushes to the shore and then falls back. There's no caliph at present, but this is an exception for Islamic history, not the norm, and may yet someday be restored. And meanwhile, God will judge people for how they uphold the law, how they practice what of it they can. So that's kind of this figure of interruption that I'm kind of toying with as one figure of the life of the Ummah. For the Western visiting Muslim scholar, the nature of the incapacitation of the Ummah takes the form of abandonment and goes deeper. It's not just something that there's the sea going to the shore and coming back. Instead, the post-colonial Muslim governments have betrayed the Ummah, abandoning them to the depredations of capital and vice. And meanwhile, religious authorities refuse to reckon with the historical corruption that now shapes every aspect of our exposed lives, from aesthetics to the nature of authority. And finally, for the Jordanian sheikh working in refugee support, we might say that the incapacitation of the Ummah takes the form of a ruin, in the sense from Walter Benjamin of a history that's both shattered, and preserved, whose moments do not simply disappear, but remain as ruins. So although he conceives of the Muslim lands spatially, um, as Aydin had described as a discursive innovation belonging to the modern science of geopolitics, he does so in the sense of a mortified image that reveals its corruption and its pain. He says, the Quran told us we could be the best community among humankind. He laughed bitterly, if we commanded good and forbade evil, but in their absence we have neither justice nor flourishing. So although at times the forms of action that are available might be viable, right, as we saw from this case of the border crisis in summer 2018, the forms of action that are available also are not, any guarantee of kind of meeting this demand from the Ummah. So this hadith about the believers being one body is ubiquitous across Muslim humanitarian sites, which amplify appeals to the unity of the Islamic community. A language of unity suffuses the domain of Islamic humanitarianism, but its field of reference is ambiguous, and the force and significance of symbolic forms is difficult to distinguish from their evacuation. As news of various incarcerations and bombing campaigns emerge into the sites of Islamic humanitarianism, claims of Muslim unity seem farcical. But then to the ruin of community, this third figure between interruption, abandonment, and ruin, that also discloses another vantage from which to view the devastated present. Sheikh Zayed said, just like those who came before us, right? We've been corrupted just like them, echoing the Quranic injunction to travel through the earth to encounter the ruins of those who came before. In the ayah, have they not journeyed upon the earth and observed how those before them fared in the end? They were greater than them in strength and left firmer traces upon the earth, yet God seized them for their sins, and they had none to shield them from God. To see the community ruined is to recognize its place, one's own place, alongside the other peoples who have passed from the face of the earth, destroyed in the end by God, against whom there is no other refuge. In somewhat resonant terms, Maurice Blanchot writes that through death, the eyes turn back, and this return is the other side, and the other side is the fact of living no longer turned away, but turned back. So to see the community ruined is to occupy the space of the future anterior, to see in its present life how it will have passed from the realm of the living, and so to glimpse in its resemblance what is already the case. All things perish save the face of God. So, wrapping up now. Bahir Zaman comments that instead of conceptualizing Ummah at a grand scale, scholars should look for it in the neighborly practices of building Islamic community through mutual aid. So as expressed through the anecdote about the border crisis, the efficacy of the Ummah is hard to deny. Islamic community is here practiced within the space of a world whose terms are largely already defined for it, right? So this is the nation states of the Sykes-Picot borders and so on. More generally, a language of unity suffuses the discourse of contemporary Islam, but its modes of incapacitation are multiple and intensive. These three interlocutors insist that although afflicted by the tribulation of wealth and the devastation of murder as much as by the imposition of colonial borders and civil war, the faithful have not simply stopped being one body. Rather than community guaranteeing the life of tradition, as in Alistair MacIntyre's narrative account of virtue, here interruption, abandonment, and ruin are revealed to be modes of the tradition of Islamic community. I might only be revisiting the obscurity and ambiguity with which I began the paper, so Gibb talking about how nothing is really what it seems, and even words cannot be relied on. But instead of delving under the semblance to uncover the vigorous inner core of Ummah, I simply suggest that the secret life of Islamic community, such as it is, lies now not in a proper unity of the believers, but in the terms of their dissolution. So Ummah interrupted, as when the Syrian Sheikh in Damascus compared the drift of Muslim flourishing to the sweep of a tide. Ummah abandoned, as when his visiting interlocutor argued that the religious and political leaders of the Muslims have forsaken them to the depredations of vicious government and leveling capital. And Ummah ruined, as when Sheikh Zayed notes the possibilities of renewal mortified at every turn through the tribulation of wealth and the devastation of murder and the colonial borders and the civil war and so on. So these interlocutors inherit the sensibilities of Muslim unity, their fellow feeling leaving them aching with sleeplessness and fever when one limb suffers. But without justice or flourishing, in the wake of the vigorous projects of pan-Islamism and the divergent confessions of post-Islamism, Ummah instead perhaps can be understood through these three figures of its present life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Iqbal. I first of all want to thank you for sharing your work, especially the ethnographic part of your paper. We are at SIGA. We are a center that often takes the nation state for granted as a kind of a naturalized part of the world order. And what I found very provocative in your paper was the potentialities in what you call the dialogues between different Muslim actors, in which their imagination troubles, or at least doesn't lend itself to the same kind of state-centered visions that are the grounding for modern geopolitics. That said, there's going to be, when you bring an anthropologist into talking at a place like SIGA, there's going to be some tension. So I'm sure Dr. Sami will have some questions for you, but this is all part of us trying to think about the Ummah. But before we get started, I want to ask a couple of clarification questions, and then we can get into some of the nitty-gritty, as they say, of the ethnography. So let me ask. So you started out by kind of tracing, I wouldn't say the literature in a sense, but kind of you took a little bit of a survey of what scholars in the field of Islamic studies and elsewhere in history, how they talk about the Ummah. I was very surprised to see Gibbs, how central the Ummah played in Gibbs' historiography of which work was that you were quoting from? Which one of Gibbs' works was that? Where he says very clearly that Ummah is like the key, to Muslim historiography.
It was a short talk he gave,
Really?
just called the Community in Islamic History, and I'm not sure if it was anthologized in kind of another volume, but I'll yeah.
Interesting. And I found, so when you were discussing Anjum's vision, Anjum's recent book on the community-centered vision, would you say that his narrative about the decline of communal will, do you find that his understanding of the early Islamic community kind of dovetails with Gibbs' understanding of the fact that there was no institutions and that the Ummah wasn't able to speak, and therefore it was lost as a reality? And then, Ibn Taymiyyah comes, in Anjum's version, Ibn Taymiyyah comes back and recenters this vision. Is there parallel there? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, maybe. I think because he's tracking this kind of process of not not entirely renewal, but a certain kind of dynamic between that early kind of community-centered dynamic and this later Timean moment, in order to, to insist that it's not a moment without precedent, and that there's, a kind of a novel way that he is, that Ibn Taymiyyah is kind of re-inheriting, aspects of that earlier mode. There might be a parallel there between Gib and Anjum that I hadn't.
So but your main point isn't really your main point is that this kind of this historical approach that both Gib and Anjum put forward has a limitation in seeing. Is that what I see? There's the methodologically that has its limitations because it tries to see the Ummah in history, right? Is that what I'm hearing from you? That, and because of that, it always turns out to be some kind of decline paradigm. Like there's always there's like this, we don't see a correspondence, one-to-one correspondence between what we find in Muslim hopes and aspirations and what we see in history, which turns out to be like, a series of kingships or sultanates and a turning of, geopolitical interests. Is that what the basic historian approach is that there's a kind of a tragedy always waiting to happen?
So I think in terms of the contrast of between what I'm trying to track here, I think it's also just a difference of project as well, right? That I'm not necessarily trying to locate the Ummah.
Because I want to know how your approach is different. So I'm trying to figure out where you fit in with these kinds of approaches. So you're saying this historical approach for, like, say, Gib and Anjum's, so maybe you could explain a little bit about how your position is different than this approach.
Yeah, so I think what I find interesting about both of those is that they don't necessarily provide a simple tragic narrative, of in the same ways that some of the other historians and political scientists addressing Ummah do. That there's far more ambiguity on the side of Gib, right? That he's like, yes, that there are these drastic shifts in what Muslim political institutions look like, but he ends on this note of of deep ambiguity, where from the outside it can be hard to see anything of the Ummah remaining, but he warns that that when it comes to Islamic matters, I'm not sure why he distinguishes Islam so precisely, but he says for it, and when it comes to Islamic matters, external indices cannot be relied upon. And so if you base your historical conclusion about the life of the Ummah based on external indices, you're going to miss what's actually happening. And so what strikes me about him is that there is this deep ambiguity that he introduces when thinking about the Ummah, and that's something.
Gibbs ambiguity is something that you want to hold on to. There's something that you want to you're saying that there's something there that is missing from, say, the work from someone like Jamil Iden, Devji, and others. That ambiguity is less in the forefront in their work.
Yeah, and specifically because he, I think I'd agree with that. Specifically because he insists on kind of methodological revision. I'm not sure if he himself takes this up, in Gib, but because his insistence does seem, quite strong on a disjuncture between historical political forms and, what he sees as the key of the Ummah. So I think you're right. I think what I would hold on to from Gib is that deep sense of ambiguity, and maybe that sense of ambiguity is what I try to mobilize in this paper to, to turn from Cohesion to discours in Bahmani's terms, right? And maybe it's that sense of ambiguity that I'm drawing on to authorize that shift. And so
you kind of hinted at this ideal versus reality tension there's a certain kind of paradoxes that we fall into when we think about the Ummah, and one of them is, is the ideal a fact? Can we find it in history? Is there Ummah now? Where is the Ummah? Which institution? So you say that this problem, this kind of like, this kind of obsession of Muslims is not just, it's not new. It's actually pretty old. You're saying that this has been a kind of ongoing conversation, at least since the night and since Gibb wrote. I mean, it seems like this was prevalent amongst Muslims. And then you say that there's some easy answers. I would say like maybe Rashid Rida's answer of trying to equate, or maybe the interpretations of Rashid Rida's work that saw Ummah as simply popular sovereignty, uh, are moments where there's an easy answer given to this tension. So, oh, we don't have Ummah, we can't see it. So no, we can, like popular sovereignty, boom, like democracy, Ummah's in action. But you're saying like those kinds of what you would call instrumentalization of the Ummah by certain political actors, um, it falls into the trap of this ideal versus reality tension that Muslims get caught up in, or even thinkers about Muslims. How does the ethnographic approach help us to think about it differently?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think um, so on this difference between,
maybe not the ethnographic approach. How does your paper help us to
yeah,
think about
yeah.
it
So
differently?
so
Maybe that's a better question.
with with the difference between kind of a fact or an aspiration, the reason I guess I'm wary of taking up those as like the key terms of this inquiry, right? Is it one or the other? Is it is the register of the Ummah at play, one of identity or one of instrumentality? Ideal versus reality. Much of those seem pretty squarely embedded in like a Weberian methodological paradigm, right? In which you can think of ideal social types, right? And then their kind of messy approximation in reality. And kind of I'm wary of that mode, I would say, of analysis, because um, it so much of it still relies on, in part because so much of it still relies on the social scientist, right, kind of turning to the stabilizing frames of historical context to mediate between social type and historical reality.
So
Um,
let me ask you, like the most I'm reason I'm rushing through my comments is because I know I want to get Dr. Sami in here. I know that he will have some comments as well, so I don't want to hog up all the time. There's a couple of questions that I'm funneling through the live feed. So I guess one of the most provocative things about your paper, meaning the one that really jumped out at me, is that your paper invites us to think about the Ummah as in ways that Muslims are not comfortable thinking about it as, which is that we need to recovering the Ummah, for instance, may mean that we may have to recover the Ummah in the form that we see it today, which is like, ruined, interrupted, and abandoned. So these are not modes of community that Muslims are comfortable in admitting. So that I think to me is the most I would say disturbing aspect of the paper, which is that like the deal is that when we talk about ideals, getting comfortable with the idea that, listen, the ummah is the question of its phenomenological existence is not that important as it is that what shape is the ummah in today? How do Muslims articulate their experience of the ummah today? And maybe we need to start to find deeper histories or resources within our tradition that helps us cope with an image of the Ummah that we as Muslims are not really comfortable in admitting. I mean, for us, the Ummah is always tied into the sacred histories of the beloved Prophet, the early community, and then thereafter, what may come to us as being, moments of, victory or justice, or, a community of philanthropy and charity. And we don't we have a difficult time as trying to think about the Ummah in these images. And I think what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're inviting us, look, we need to think about the Ummah in these images, and forget about, or maybe I don't want to say forget about, but as people in SIGA, who are thinking about international relations and stuff, that maybe we need to put aside this whole political program of trying to find the Ummah in nation states, or military power, or economic indices, or something like that, but just get comfortable, kind of sit down, relax in our seats, and get comfortable with these images of the Ummah. And maybe they won't do the work that we want it to do, right? It may not lend itself to the instrumentalization for geopolitical calculus that we want it to, but it's the ways in which everyday human beings, everyday Muslims, in their different contexts, for instance, the context that you talk about, that is how they are articulating their experience of the Ummah. And if we start speaking more closer to that, maybe we would have a more comprehensive understanding of the Ummah. But that to me is a quite original contribution.
Yeah, thank you for that gloss. I think part of what's at play in this paper, and also kind of in its reception too, is different disciplines also, and different kind of discursive modes. So I think if venturing into the territory of thinking about political relations, or kind of international politics and so on, or political theory there, or history, I think much of what I was kind of taking my distance from, I think certainly still has its place and is important. I think when it came to I think I would certainly agree with how you responded just now. I think what I'd say is, when it comes to the ethnographic task of trying to understand what my interlocutors are saying, I found these other kind of available models for thinking about the Ummah, between ideal versus reality and so on. I found them unhelpful, to thinking about these different modes of devastation, and actually kind of sitting with them longer. That often it seems like if I were taking up these available coordinates for thinking about the Ummah between ideal and reality, then admitting a certain distance from the ideal type would quickly become a matter of diagnosing that distance, and then that would be the end of the story. But instead, trying to listen to these different figures of the Ummah that are embedded within their dialogues. For me, trying to understand them, and how they and I kind of am implicated in this vision of the present, right, as a scene of devastation. Certainly one that I found, certainly had traction across the sites of my fieldwork. I found that to be the more kind of methodologically compelling than turning to some kind of broad view of available through political science or history and so on. But on that front, I do want to say just that the reasons I was referring to Anjum's book and the case of Rila and so on, in those cases, there is the dialogue set up between the ethnography and the history, because what I find very helpful helpful about them as reference points is that they allow us to view contemporary articulations of the Ummah not just as the kind of a modern invention of a tradition of community, right, that's bound by its contemporary historical context and so on, but it allows us to think about these in in relation to earlier moments or earlier articulations of the Ummah within, certainly a different historical conceptual grammar, but there are resonances and patterns that start to appear kind of across these and differences across these different articulations. And so Anjum's book in particular, as he kind of notes, is not simply a kind of a tragic story, going back to your earlier comment, or at least not that I don't quite read it that way, that there's a certain development of political institutions and that evacuates certain modes of, a community-centered vision, but it also still remains in reserve, available to be kind of re-articulated in various ways later on. And so that dynamic is something that I kind of see my contemporary interlocutors kind of in dialogue with implicitly as well, right? So turning to a tradition and articulating aspects of its elements, that have a more complicated relationship to the past and the Islamic inheritance than one simply bound by its contemporary context.
All right, Dr. Sami, did you want to step in here?
Sure. Let's see if I am okay. I think I'm unmuted. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I want to thank you first for bringing this topic and bringing Dr. Iqbal. It's a fascinating topic. It's a topic that we have been very much interested in from the day we started the center. We even organized 4 conferences, annual conferences, and we called it the Muslim Ummah Conference. Certainly, when you look back, we have a Quranic concept, as you have mentioned. We have a historical experience, and we have current realities. And you have to put these together and see what does that mean. And I think that's what our speaker was trying to point out. If we look at today's situation, no one can argue convincingly that we had one Ummah politically since the days of Siffin. I mean, since the early days of Imam Ali's Caliphate. That means we really had, if you want to consider this as one leader type of Ummah, they probably maybe about less than 50 years, 30 years plus. And I think since Westphalia, the emergence of the nation state system, we had a different kind of realities. And in the terminology of someone like Mearsheimer, an international relations expert, he always argues that probably the most potent, the strongest ideology that we have today, and he doesn't mean today, 21st century, but certainly throughout the 20th century, is nationalism. And that is a direct conflict with the whole concept of the Ummah. So even within the Islamic movement themselves, who have or have had political projects, that was embedded in their behavior, was embedded in their policies, was embedded in their structure, where the nation state, and I think several scholars have pointed this out, whenever there's a lot of rhetoric about the Muslim Ummah, but when it comes to the actual policies and the actual things on the ground, they will always opt for the national project, so to speak, which in some instances are in direct conflict with the Ummah. So there are certainly some questions, and of course I would like to hear the comments of our speaker. How do we define the Ummah? I mean, is it a spiritual and social? Is that satisfactory? Is it religious? Is it political, or is it combined in all of them? And the challenges that we face today to reconstitute, and I think that's what most people who are thoughtful, and they talk about the caliphate and the reconstitution of the caliphate, or recalling of the caliphate, or that the caliphate should be one of the options that people should think. I mean, in the background, it's this concept of one Ummah. It's just the concept that we are all one Ummah, but have we ever been one Ummah? And if we are, how do we reconstitute this? Of course, I have my own ideas about this, which I probably would share at least the broader things. But the question I would like to ask is that what would be the convincing argument for the majority of Muslims that indeed there is a viable political project for one ummah where there will be winners and losers? Look at, for instance, those who live in rich countries. Are they willing to sacrifice their lifestyle for this concept? Because there is a price to pay if we are going to do that. Secondly, if this is again, that's part of the question, is it a political, intellectual, or a spiritual project to reconstitute the Ummah? Of course, Jamil Aydin would argue that we never really had this concept, and it's all a part of the empire, and it's all a imagination of the Islamic movement so that they can have the upper hand in their pursuit of having a state, so to speak. But should we accept this, or should we go back and try to come up with a better definition of what an ummah is in the 21st century? And therefore, should we accept the nation-state system and try to work within it, which would be one approach, or should we basically reject it? And then our project in reconstituting the ummah is to come up with a different system than the nation-state, in which case our challenges have been multiplied several times because that's the international system we live in today. We can look at the experiment of ISIS, putting aside their violence and their irrationality, but it came from that background, is that they're not going to recognize borders. They're not going to recognize this international system. They will impose their understanding of the historical experience of a Muslim Ummah is, and they're going to reconstitute the caliphate in the way they thought is going to capture the imagination of Muslims, which it didn't. I think there's a lot to learn about that experience. Of course, it was a failed experience, but it's an important experience nevertheless. So that's really my real question is, we need to answer these questions. Should we accept the nation-state system, or can we redefine the Muslim Ummah with the acceptance of the nation-state system? That's one question. The other is there have been several interpretations of why we had the interruption. I mean, it's very interesting titles. Dr. Iqbal chose interrupted, abandoned, ruined. They all apply certainly, but the interruption, of course, about the iqfal bab al-ijtihad, the closing of the ijtihad. So there are certain questions, certain challenges, I should say. First, some people say that our weakness has become internal, therefore we need to strengthen ourselves internally so that we can try to reconstitute our past. Others who argue that our real challenges are external because basically we are so weak. Most of the sources of our weakness come from outside, and unless we face that challenge, whether it was colonization, Zionism, new colonial powers, globalization, you name it, that we have to overcome these challenges before we can actually, in other words, you have to win over them, constitute a political triumph, victory, and then you can reconstitute from the internal, because you cannot do it with the present. And of course, some argue it's both. So my question is, how does our speaker look at these questions about the reconstitution of the Ummah? In my humble view is that one aspect is that if there's going to be a vanguard people who would like to work in reality, because conceptually, it's not going to make a difference. And I think he comes from a background is that I want whatever concept that they will be applied on the ground. I think that's what I understood. That there has to be some sort of a worldwide movement that brings Muslims from different backgrounds, different nationalities, different ethnicities where they come together and really apply these concepts in reality. And I think as we come up with that and come up with institutions that reflect that, I think the closest you have, even though it is not by any means a good example for the rest of the world, is what happens between Muslims and Western countries. Because they're a minority, they have to come together. And even though you still have certain ethnic lines, but at least they learn how to come together, how to work together, and how to be sensitive to each other. We haven't had that chance yet, and with the strength of the nation-state system, we're having difficulty making it happen. In the past, you could see Muslim scholars, they go from Morocco to Indonesia, they can go anywhere, and they can impact, and they can an exchange of population, so on and so forth. We're deprived of that. And then the other challenge, and I'm going to stop here, other than nation-state, is this secular paradigm. This modernity and the challenges they present, and what is the role of Sharia? These are some tough questions that you cannot talk about the Ummah without talking about the Sharia. It doesn't make sense that you have this concept of an Ummah without knowing how does the Ummah practice its role without talking about the role of Sharia in public life, which is still an unsettled question. And in most societies, it hasn't been, not only it hasn't been answered, but it has been rejected. Or if it is applied in a very superficial way, that means that not only you have a political project, but you also have to have an intellectual project that can reconcile these two things together. Now, from your experience, I understand, people deal with realities, but I want to go beyond the realities into the future, try to see how we can reconstitute that concept by asking these questions. Is it viable? How do we do it? And at what price? Thank you.
I mean, I think all those questions are the questions that kind of at the heart also of the three figures that I'm trying to present here. I think the three interlocutors in particular, the kind of from the ethnographic part of the paper, the Syrian professor and the visiting Western scholar and the Jordanian sheikh active in refugee support, they all were deeply engaged with these questions, but their answers to these questions were also far apart, both in how they understood the question of viability that you ended with, Dr. Sami, and also how and at what price. Their answers to these questions were deeply divided, and to me, I think that stems from key differences in how they viewed the devastation of the present and how far they saw it reaching and the modes that it took. And so this might be a way that that ethnographic material might be in conversation with these broader political theoretical questions that you are turning us toward, in that it might be, from this vantage point of that ethnography, that through looking at how these interlocutors conceptualize the contemporary incapacitation of the Ummah, whether they think of it as an interruption or an abandonment or as a ruin, that each of these figures allows for different kinds of political and ethical relationships to take place. And so just to revisit a little bit, for the one Syrian professor thinking about the Ummah as being interrupted, if the form of the incapacitation of the Ummah takes the form of an interruption, his example was that of the sea, which goes and comes. And so at the moment, he said that the nation-state system, is dominant and hegemonic. At some point, maybe, there will be a caliph again in some form that, that is as yet unknown to us. But what remains to us is the practice of the Sharia and building up our relationships with our neighbors. And what lies beyond that is not something that we are responsible for. And so there's a kind of a division that he suggests between the practice of religion and the domain of politics. And that division lies in this image of the sea going and coming back to the shore. And so at some point, some historical point, different political conditions might allow for different kinds of solidarity and community. But for now, there is this division between the practice of religion and the political conditions in which we live. And I think that image, that sense of Ummah interrupted, is one that is quite widespread. And two, its implications of a certain division between the possibilities of politics and one's religious practices. In contrast, the visiting, so in part you can see kind of how each of these three figures aren't simply about what these three people are thinking. They also represent broader configurations of the present and its possibilities. For the visiting scholar, the nature of the incapacitation of the Ummah takes the form of abandonment, where even those who should be responsible for its for securing its integrity and so on, have betrayed the Ummah and have abandoned the Muslims to basically the globalization of the world through the circuits of capital, and basically the inner transformation of ummatic spaces to different kinds of corruption, where even his example was that of even Muslim aesthetics from our history no longer have the same kind of resonance, and so on. So in this mode of, or in this figure of abandonment, the devastation of the present goes deeper, and he is not visiting scholar was not content with this division between politics and religion, as allowing for the space still of a certain kind of continuity with with kind of the religious tradition. For him, he saw the abandonment of the Ummah as affecting even the forms of religiosity as itself. And then finally, in the third of these figures of ruin, we can see these as like intensifying even further. In that figure of a ruin, the destruction of the Ummah goes even further yet, where even the forms that are available to do some of the work of repair of the Ummah are themselves corrupted as well, because we do live in a single world of neoliberalism and environmental destruction and these kinds of circuits of global capital, and even his sense of it isn't simply either of interruption or abandonment, but a kind of fracturing of the kind of political forms that are available. And so that requires a far more kind of tense living among the ruins of what has been inherited, and still finding ways to express mutual compassion and solidarity. But I think at that point, and this is where my own sensibilities lie as well, at that point the hope of stepping outside the cruelty of of the state and so on has almost been relinquished. And so I think that might be where I also locate myself, if from both of your questions they were kind of turning toward that kind of question of where my sympathies lie as well. But we have these three different figures of interruption, abandonment, and ruin, three figures of kind of an intensifying incapacitation of the Ummah, and my sense is how we think about that destruction will have implications on the kinds of political imaginations are still viable.
Well, it just, if I may, wait for a second here. But don't we see also a fourth phenomena where at some points we see also an embrace? It's not total abandonment or interruption.
Right.
I mean, we could see it in some cases. You know, when the Arab Spring came, the whole Ummah thought that it's time for revival. When Palestine erupts or something, we see this sense of solidarity, or Afghanistan or Iraq or other crises where people. So I think we could still say that there are also hope and optimism. It's not all ruin and interruption and abandonment. Don't you think?
Yes, exactly. And the anecdote about the crisis at the border between Jordan and Syria, I think, was meant to demonstrate some of that as well. You know, that certainly even if the kind of dominant political paradigms are you know, kind of insist that, you know, the crisis is happening on the other side of the border, the Jordanians can do nothing. It's because of this sense of you know, ummatic fellow feeling that that the Muslims insisted that something yet be done, and so there certainly are those kinds of spaces of you know, expression of solidarity and so on. But the sense I got from the figure who was active in coordinating that was that even he, you know, he saw this as an expression of, he saw this as his response, you know, to the suffering of the Ummah, just like in the hadith about, you know, the believers being one body. But on its own, it's not going to, you know, restore the integrity of the Ummah as a political body. And so it's that kind of tempered optimism, I think, that there's still space for.
But there is hope.
Of a sort.
I think we have went over time, so I want to thank Professor Iqbal for his generous talk, and also his sharing his work with us. Um, we had a number of people joining live, and we would like to have a lot more questions and discussion with you, but unfortunately our time is closed. Please stay tuned for all the people who are listening on our live channel for our next webinar next week. We have a Professor Akturk, who will be discussing his proposal for Turkish foreign policy. So stay in tune for that. I would like to conclude this session webinar at this time. Thanks again for your participation.
Thank you, always. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.